Well, hello, everybody. It is right at noon, but we are going to wait just a little bit. So if anybody else is trying to get on, just a note too that this is a Zoom webinar. It's not a regular Zoom meeting that you're probably familiar with. So if you were a little confused that you don't see yourself when you logged on today, that is why. It's because it's a webinar and not a traditional Zoom meeting. So really the only difference is that you cannot see your own self, and I can't see you either. It's not like I have those abilities. So it's a little different, but just like a regular Zoom, please use the chat and ask questions. I think that on your chat, there's a little drop-down box that says, if you click it, it says either all panelists or all panelists and attendees. Make sure to click all panelists and attendees so that way everybody can see your question or comment. You're welcome to make comments too. It doesn't have to be just questions. That's one thing about, and if you participated in my boiling water canning class last month, I think I mentioned that, that's one part about learning, particularly in person, that we miss out on is when we're here in the kitchen and doing hands-on activities like canning, and we're waiting for the canner to boil and just kind of standing around where we're talking and asking questions. That's where a lot of the learning takes place and a lot of ideas are shared. So please feel free to use the chat for that. But we will go ahead and get started. I know that there's over 100 people that have registered for the webinar, but I think a lot of people registered knowing that they can watch the recording, which of course is fine as well. And you all who are here will get the recording too, which as you see it is being recorded. All right. Well, welcome everybody to the Dehydrating Basics class. I am Elizabeth Coots and I am the Woodford County Extension Agent for Family and Consumer Sciences. So thank you for joining with this food preservation series. Like I said, today we're talking all about dehydrating. So I am going to share my screen. Of course, I have a PowerPoint with lots of tips and tricks and ideas. And we are going to try something a little different. I have Ruby behind the camera, behind the computer, and we're going to try to change the layout. So hopefully this will work. Give us just a minute. And actually, if you all don't mind, I'm going to do my little intro over because we'll edit all this out. I'm trying to make this a little more like an educational video that we'll put on YouTube rather than just a Zoom chatting. So I want to do that intro again after we get the screen shared. Looks good? Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. Well, thank you all for joining us today for the Dehydrating Basics class. I'm Elizabeth Coots, and I am the Woodford County Extension Agent for Family and Consumer Sciences. And I'm glad that you all are joining us here today to learn all about dehydrating. You probably know, or it might make sense that dehydrating it's really the original method of food preservation. Thousands of years ago, people would just lay their food outside and it would dry. And when it was dried, it lasted longer. And the reason for that is because dehydrating removes the moisture of food, and removing that moisture slows the enzyme action. So as you know, when you either pick a piece of produce, or even if you go to the grocery store and buy produce, it will eventually rot. And those are those enzymes working in that produce to break down the fruit or vegetable. So when we dehydrate and we remove the moisture, it is basically slowing that enzyme process. So our food can last a lot longer. With dehydrating your food, something to keep in mind is that flavors and nutrients concentrate, and that also includes sugar. So when we think about dehydrating fruit, that sugar content of that fruit is going to concentrate, which is why if you've ever had a dehydrated piece of fruit, it tastes like candy. And a lot of times you can just, or at least I can, I'll speak for myself. I can sit there and eat a whole pint of dehydrated strawberries, but I have to ask myself, would I eat an entire pint of strawberries by themselves? No. So I probably shouldn't eat that many dehydrated strawberries, even though they taste delicious. But everything is concentrated when we dehydrate food. And why do you dehydrate food at home? Why would you want to do that? If what is your personal reason? Put that in the chat if you don't mind, what reason you personally want to dehydrate. For me, I like the savings of it because dehydrated food purchased commercially can be rather expensive, and a lot of times there's added stuff to it, and it's usually a preservative or sugar, and I like to know what's in my food. So when I dehydrate my own, I can control that. So it might be something different for you. Maybe you have a garden and you want to preserve that harvest. So dehydrating is one way to do that. Of course, dehydrated food is lighter. This is a whole bag of apples right here. It is definitely lighter. It takes up a lot less space. And of course, it is going to last a lot longer than fresh apples will. So we're going to talk a little bit about ways to dehydrate food, but I want to stop here and make sure to let you know that this presentation is coming from this publication. I'll get a little closer so maybe you can see it. It's the Dehydrating Food at Home publication from the University of Kentucky Cooperative Extension Service. So everything that I'm talking about today, everything that's in my PowerPoint slide is in this publication. And you should have received this either in a link from me, from this signing up for this class, and or if you stopped by to pick up the printed copies of all of our food preservation publications, which is quite a thick packet. But if you haven't done that, or if you decide you want the printed copies, we have those available here at the Woodford County Extension Office for you to come pick up. Or if you are outside of the Woodford County area, you can contact your local county extension office, whether or not you have an FCS agent, because some counties have vacancies, and they can print these publications for you. So this is going to be our guide today as we go through. This is where all of my notes and slides came from. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about methods of dehydrating food. So you can dehydrate outdoors, like the old days, and you can dehydrate inside with some new equipment that we have. So let's talk a little bit about that. We'll kind of go through each of these methods very briefly, and then we're gonna hit a little more on the dehydrating with a dehydrator part. Okay, so sun drying. As you see here, most successful is if you have a dry climate, if you have low humidity, and if you have breezy conditions. Now, of course, Kentucky weather has been strange lately. When is it not? We've had summer and now winter. We're kind of in the middle there, but we typically do not have these conditions. We usually have really high humidity. It's not really dry all the time, and may or may not have a breeze. So it's not ideal to dehydrate in the sun, and it can take a very long time to dehydrate in the sun. It's not exactly recommended, especially for vegetables and meats. Herbs are probably, and as that's what you see in this picture, are herbs. That would be the best for dehydrating in the sun. And this may or may not be how some people sun dry in Kentucky. And we won't talk about the food safety aspect of this, but you can just imagine what my response would be if someone said, this is how I dehydrate my fruits and vegetables in Kentucky. The next option is solar drying, and this is different than sun drying. Sun drying is just using the direct sun. Solar drying is using the sun as a heat source. So it's kind of like making an oven. It's designed to concentrate those sun's rays, and it speeds speeds up the process. And everything is covered with solar drying. With sun drying, it's just outside in the sun. Here, everything is inside this container here. Very interesting little apparatus here for solar drying. Another option is vine drying, or as I like to call it, the lazy man's way of dehydrating. I have accidentally dehydrated some fruits and vegetables by vine drying, not doing it on purpose. You basically just leave the beans and peas on the vine. That's what this is for, is beans and peas. You just keep them on the vine until they're dry. Until they are shriveled up, and when you shake them, they kind of rattle a little bit. You can hear the bean or the pea kind of moving around in that pod. And to test for dryness, they should shatter when you hit it. So it should kind of break apart. It should be very dry. And an important note is that vine-dried foods must be pasteurized. And that actually goes for all foods that are dehydrated in the outdoors. Should be pasteurized. And this basically will kill any insects or eggs or any other bacteria that may be present on the food that was dried outside. You can do it in the freezer or in the oven. In the freezer, you would seal your dried food in either a freezer bag or in some kind of a container that is airtight, and you would put it in your freezer for 48 hours. Very easy. Or you can pasteurize in the oven, and you would arrange the food on a cookie sheet, and you would put it in the oven, either 160 degrees for 30 minutes or 175 degrees for 15 minutes. And that would just is to ensure safety. So let's talk about dehydrating inside. I see the chat blinking. Is there a question? No. Okay, just comments. Good. So one of the ways that you can dehydrate inside is just in your oven. And you see here these pictures, there's a spoon inside the oven door to prop it open, and the other picture there has the door propped a little more open. So it can be very lengthy to dehydrate in your regular oven. It can take 2 to 3 times longer than your electric dehydrator. It consumes more energy. So if you think running your stove as opposed to running a small countertop appliance, you're definitely using more energy. And it can be kind of hard because you really want to have an airflow. So how are you going to be able to circulate air in your oven? Are you going to, open it maybe every few minutes, prop it open like that, which might make your house warmer as well? And will the temperature of your oven go as low as 140 degrees? Most ovens don't go that low. If it doesn't, it's not going to be effective to dehydrate food at 160 degrees or more. So it's really, you can do it for sure, but it's not the most effective. Another option inside is dehydrating in your microwave. And you see the very first bullet there, not recommended. And you see the picture, that's burned mango, I believe, that a coworker tested, and obviously it didn't turn out very well. Drying times in the microwave, you have to have it running like 30 minutes to an hour, which is a really long time for a microwave to run. Of course, you have to use a really low setting or defrost setting. It might burn, as you see in this picture, and it could cause a fire. And we want to prevent that. But you can read your owner's manual of your microwave and see if that is an option, if that's something that you are interested in. But like I said, it's not the best recommended. The best way to dehydrate food nowadays is to use a countertop electric dehydrator, similar to these two that I have here that I'm going to talk a little bit more about. It is definitely the quickest, easiest way to dry food indoors. They have an electric element that provides heat in the bottom, and they also have fans. So those two things are very important, heat and a fan, and low heat, I should say. We're not cooking the food, we're just heating it just enough, circulating that air to remove that moisture. So we just need a little bit of both of those. But you can dehydrate fruits and vegetables and meats, fruit leather, herbs, all in these countertop indoor dehydrators. Usually there is a temperature control. And one thing I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me go on to the next slide. So when you are purchasing a dehydrator, if you don't have one yet, of course, there's lots and lots of different options out there. As you can imagine, you could spend anywhere from $40 on up to hundreds of dollars on a dehydrator. But you want to make sure that the brand that you're looking at is a well-known brand. And if it is a well-known brand, then it probably has the Underwriter Laboratories seal of approval. And that's usually UL, and it says seal of approval next to it. That just means that it's safe and it's been tested, and it's a good one to purchase. You also want to look to make sure, like I said, and you see I have those two bolded, that it has a heating element that's inside and that it also has a fan. I have seen some food dehydrators that have one or the other, and they're just not as efficient as ones that have both. Most of them do have both, but just make sure to look for that so that you know what you're buying. Most of them, I shouldn't say most of them. It's important I think, to buy one where you can regulate the temperature. I do have one here at the office that is just plug in and it starts. There's no button on it. There's no settings. You plug it in and a little red light turns on that says it's on. It doesn't even tell you what temperature it is. So it's not exactly efficient. It works, but again, I don't know what temperature it is. One that I would recommend is one that has the temperature setting and a time setting. So, but then even then you want to, kind of think about the options and what you want. So this one up here has, it has an on-off switch, and then it has a temperature setting here, a little knob where I can turn, but it only has 6 options for temperature: 95, 105, 115, 135, 145, and 160. This other one that I have down here, which I prefer ones that have this, it is digital and you can choose specifically your temperature. So if with this one, if you wanted to dehydrate something at 120 or 140, you couldn't select that because it's very specific. And I like the digital too, because I like to see exactly what temperature it is on. But like I said, this one has a knob, and then this one is digital. There's lots of different ones out there. Another feature that I prefer is a timer. So I like to have, this one has a timer, and not only a timer to where you can set it for like 7 hours and then it would just turn off, but it also will count up. So if you're dehydrating something and you're going to be home all day, you're not really sure how long it's going to take, you can just say go and it will count up. So once you see, oh, my fruit leather is done, you can look and see, okay, that took 5 hours. If you're going to make that again, you can make a note of that. So just know what you're buying before you buy it. Know what features it has. And then, of course, very important that you read your manual for your dehydrators, and you know that if there's any warranty, and also customer service. Your dehydrator will definitely come with a booklet, usually, of course, instructions, but also a booklet of recipes for your dehydrator. And we always say, our information is what's recommended, but definitely read along with your manual and see what it says. Another part of the dehydrator, or a piece of the dehydrator, I should say, is the fruit leather tray. And if the dehydrator, usually dehydrators will come with these, but if they don't, you can purchase these on your own separately. It's just a plastic tray that you can pour liquid on. Or if you have something little teeny tiny, you can also put that on the tray. But they also have a mesh tray. There's little holes in it. It's kind of like a screen. So if you were doing something small, blueberries or peas, you could put that on here as well. And those are very, very handy to have, both of those. Okay, so a little bit more about using your dehydrator. I think a dehydrator is one of those appliances that either you have it and you use it a lot, or you're like, oh yeah, I have a dehydrator downstairs in the basement in the storage room. Maybe I should get that out. So if you have it, I would encourage you to use it. Try it out. You know, make it worth your money to have that dehydrator, and make some fruit leathers and some dried vegetables for soups in the winter time. So it's important that when you're dehydrating that you preheat the dehydrator. That's the stuff a lot of people forget, but you want to preheat it about 10 degrees higher than what your temperature is going to be. So if I was going to be drying at 140 degrees, I would preheat it to 150 degrees so that it's warm once I put my food in there. Another little tip, depending on what you're dehydrating, if it's something, usually fruits, since they have a higher sugar content, they can be a little sticky. If you take just a little bit of vegetable spray and spray your tray or your screen or the fruit leather tray, that will really aid in peeling that off once you're finished, especially fruit leather. That's the one that you don't want to dehydrate fruit leather without using vegetable spray. You can also use, if you don't want to use vegetable spray, and when you do use this, you want to use it just a little bit. You know, you're not spraying it like you're baking a cake. It's very, very just minimal. Sometimes I will spray it on, especially the fruit leather tray, and just kind of wipe it off with a paper towel, because it just needs to be a very slight coating, because we don't want a lot of oil on what we're dehydrating, because that can then potentially make it go rancid because of that oil. So we want just a little bit. With the dehydrator, so once you put your food in the dehydrator, that's when you'll decrease your temperature from what you've preheated it to. And it's usually, most things are around 130 to 140 degrees, but again, that's where your manual will come in handy, so you know exactly. Okay, so the next segment is drying fruit. So let's talk a little bit about drying fruit. Of course, not all fruit is suitable for drying. Fruits like oranges and grapefruits, juicy fruits like that, don't always dehydrate very well. And of course, with anything, peeling is optional. So we have some apples here that we dehydrated, and we did not remove the peel. We left the peel on. And of course, well, I like that reason because you don't have to peel it, but also you're getting that added benefit of the nutrients, of the fiber that's in the peel. So it is optional, but it's up to you and what your preference is, if you want to leave it on or not. Whether you're, you know, fruits or vegetables, you want to make sure that you're starting, just like any food preservation, starting with the best quality of that fruit, because what you dehydrate is what you're going to get out. And I say that with canning, what you can and freeze is what you're going to get out. If you are going to dehydrate something that's about to go bad, when you eat it, you might be able to tell that, oh, it's about to go bad. It's because you dehydrated a less quality of a fruit. Same with freezing and canning. So the best quality is you're going to get the best end product of what you're dehydrating. Oh, and that last piece, or the, well, no, it's not on there. With fruits like grapes and cherries and blueberries that you would be dehydrating whole, you don't have to cut those, but the skins need to be checked. And that's, there's more information in the publication about that. That's essentially, you are blanching them. So you're going to boil them for the amount of time that specifies in the publication, plunge it in ice cold water for a moment, drain any of the excess moisture, and then put it on your dehydrator to dry it. But those can be dried whole as long as you crack the skins. And the reason for that is basically to allow for the moisture to escape better. If you don't crack it, it will take a lot longer to dehydrate. Okay, so pre-treating. When we think about apples or even bananas, anything that you cut that you know browns will need to be pre-treated. And really anything, it aids in a better quality product during storage if you pre-treat it. But it is optional. You don't have to do this. It improves the appearance and also the quality of that product. And like I said, it prevents browning. It helps to preserve the color and the flavor as well. So there's several options, as you saw here on the list. So we'll kind of briefly go through these. So the first one is acid dips and fruit juice dips. So a lot of people, I think of lemon juice when you think of putting an acid on a fruit that you are going to dehydrate, and lemon juice certainly is an option. I don't prefer lemon juice because then my apples taste a little lemony, and maybe you like the tartness, and that's fine. But the other options are ascorbic acid, and that's just a vitamin C tablet that has been crushed, mixed with water, and then your fruit has been soaked in that water, or a product called Fruit Fresh. And it is essentially ascorbic acid as well. And there's directions on the package for how to use that, but it's the same. It's a powder, and you mix it with water, put your prepared fruit in that water and let it sit, drain it, and pat it dry, and then put it in the dehydrator. The other option, which I prefer, is fruit juice. And you can use any type of acidic fruit juice. Apple, orange, pineapple, grape, and cranberry are the most common. And you would do the same as you would do with the water. You would submerge your prepared fruit in that juice for about 3 to 5 minutes, or however long in the publication it would say for that particular fruit. Drain it, pat it dry, and then put it on your trays for dehydrating. And then when you use fruit juice, you can drink the juice afterwards. You can save it. It's still good. Another option is a honey dip. And as you can imagine, this is a little bit sweeter of an option. It does add flavor, of course. It adds a little bit of color as well. So with this, you would mix a half a cup of sugar with 1.5 cups of boiling water. You would dissolve that and cool it to lukewarm. So you still want it to be warm, not room temperature. You would then add to that a half a cup of honey, and you would stir that to dissolve, and then you would soak your prepared fruit in that mixture, and then you would drain it, wipe away the excess moisture, and then dehydrate it. And of course, doing it this way adds a little bit of sugar. And again, it's what you prefer, but this method I don't prefer just because it adds sugar. And dehydrated fruit to me is already sweet enough. But this is another option that you can do to prevent browning and prolong the life of your dehydrated fruit. So the other options are blanching, and there's syrup blanching, and then there's steam blanching. So let's talk about syrup blanching. This is usually used for apples and bananas and pears. It does add calories, and also the honey blanching adds calories too. This syrup blanching, though, causes the end product to be more like candied fruit. So it is a lot sweeter, and it's a cup of sugar, a cup of light corn syrup, and 2 cups of water. So that's really a 1-to-1 ratio of, sugar to water with the sugars, corn syrup, and water. You would bring that to a boil. You would add 1 pound of your prepared fruit. So, and when I say prepared fruit, I mean already sliced and cored and cut up to where it's ready to put on the dehydrator. Okay, so you're not going to put a whole apple in there. You're going to put your cored and sliced apple in there. So you would add it to the saucepan, bring it back to a boil, or excuse me, you would add the fruit to the liquid, your prepared boiled liquid, and you would simmer it for 10 minutes. And then you would remove that pan from the heat, and then you let it sit for 30 minutes. So it's going to kind of thicken up, as you can imagine, just a little bit, so that it kind of coats that fruit. And then you will take the fruit out of the syrup. You'll rinse it just a little bit in cold water, because you still want a little bit of that thick sugary mixture on there. And then you would dry it, drain it, and or pat off the excess moisture, and then put it in your dehydrator to dry. So steam blanching is the other option, and steam blanching does help to maintain the color, but it does change the flavor and the texture a little bit. And the reason for that is because you're cooking it a little bit, and it is very similar to your traditional blanching. You would put several inches of water in a saucepan, not so much though that when you put your steamer basket in, that your fruit will be submerged. You want water to be underneath where your steamer basket would go. You would bring that to a boil. You would put your fruit in, and you want to make sure that your fruit, it's recommended that it's no deeper than about 2 inches. And if you think about that, the reason, if you had a big pot and your steamer basket's way down here, and you filled up your pot above that steamer basket with fruit, okay, the fruit on the bottom is probably going to be mushy by the time the fruit all the way up here at the top is steamed and ready to take out. So in order to make sure that all your fruit is going to be cooked consistently, make sure that it's about 2 inches or so of fruit on your steamer basket. And even then, you may have to stir it throughout, maybe once throughout the process. You can check it and see. But the times for that are dependent on each fruit, and you can see that in the publication in the chart in there. But you just want to make sure that it's all even. But again, same process, you would drain it, shake off any or wipe off any excess moisture, and then it's ready to dehydrate. So now talking about ready to dehydrate. And one thing I want to note, earlier I said citrus fruits are not very good for dehydrating, but you see here, there's a picture of beautiful orange slices. I like to dehydrate orange slices or even the little mini mandarin orange slices, and then put them in my tea. But it just kind of adds a little bit of a flavor. And you can also, you can eat them, peel off the peel and eat them. But it is a little difficult to get that to where it's just right, because they can be really, really dry. Okay, so drying the prepared fruit. So I mentioned spraying the tray with cooking spray if you'd like, that's optional. With fruit, it's probably really important to spray the tray because, like I said, there can be a higher sugar content and it can be a little stickier. With vegetables, not as much. But a good rule of thumb is the flatter the fruit or vegetable or puree that you're dehydrating, the more you're going to need that cooking spray. So you would put the fruit pieces in a single layer on your tray. You want to make sure that they don't touch a whole lot and that they don't overlap, because they'll stick together. So after they're dehydrated, you'll have, a sheet of apple slices that is all one piece kind of. So make sure they don't touch. Again, make sure to read your manual, but most fruits should be dehydrated at about 135 to 40 degrees. Just check your manual to make sure on that. And you might have to turn either the fruit in the tray halfway through, or you might have to rotate your trays. And again, rotating the trays, check your manual to see what it says. If you, at some point, I always like to check, when I'm dehydrating, I peek at it and look at it. And sometimes I'll eat it, even if it's not done, I just, want to taste it and see what it tastes like. If you see that maybe it's not dehydrating even, like if the top is still kind of soft, but the bottom is dry, then you can flip that fruit over. Or sometimes I have to do that with a fruit leather. Maybe there's still like a ring of, it looks wet in the middle, and I'll peel it off and flip it over so it can dry faster. If you do that, it's recommended to not use your fingers, depending on how long you're planning on storing your dehydrated food, because our fingers, of course, have a little bit of oil on them. And when we're touching all our food with that little bit of oil on our fingers, again, kind of like the cooking spray on the tray, that can potentially cause that fruit to go rancid a little faster. So try to prevent that. But if you're going to be eating it, within a few weeks, maybe, I know dehydrated fruit and fruit leathers at my house don't last very long because they're like candy and we love to eat them. So usually when we make them, we have a plan to eat them, take them hiking or backpacking and eat them while we're out. Okay, so checking to see if your fruit is done. So you can cut it different pieces in half, and you can also kind of break them in half. You shouldn't be able to see any visible moisture inside that fruit, and you shouldn't be able to squeeze out any wetness. So you can kind of squeeze it with your finger and check to see if there's any moisture. You can also get a paper towel and squeeze it in that paper towel and see if there's any moisture. The fruit should be pliable, and I'm going to take out a little apple here and get closer so you can see. So the fruit should bend. See how this bends very nicely here? It's not cracking either. So I have definitely dehydrated fruit before where I, dehydrated it way too long, and when I bend it like this, it cracked. Now, it was still good. It was still safe to eat. It was just very, very dry. It was more like an apple chip than a dehydrated apple, which wasn't that great. It's not like an apple chip like you might think. And then you can eat that piece, whether or not it's dry or not. After you test it, you can eat that piece. Let's see. Okay, so after your fruit is all dry, there's a couple things that you want to do. The first one, after you make sure everything is dry, you want to cool the fruit. So cool it down to room temperature. That might take up to an hour, depending on the temperature in your kitchen or wherever you're dehydrating. I like to, if I'm ready to cool it down quickly, I will take the lid off my dehydrator and I will set my trays or if I have enough room, around the kitchen so that that air can kind of cool it down a lot faster. If it's warm, of course, when you put it in the package, whether it's a bag or a jar, it can create condensation. And of course, that's complete opposite of what we want when we're drying food. That can then make the food go bad quicker. And also, you don't want to let it sit too long in your dehydrator. So cool it down and package it. If you see that, maybe you look at your dried food that's all finished and you see, oh, some of my strawberries are really dry and some of my strawberries are nice and pliable, kind of like this apple that I just moved. You can condition your fruit. And what that means is, and actually I do have strawberries here that probably need to be conditioned. We just took them off the dehydrator today. We put them on last night. So there are pieces in here that are, and I can't tell by looking at it which ones are drier than the others, but if you put all of those pieces in an airtight container for about 7 to 10 days and shake it each day, just have it on the countertop, shake it each day, that will basically move the moisture from some of the wetter strawberries or fruit into the drier strawberries. So it'll kind of even out the moisture, which is really pretty cool. And after you do that, if you see that, oh, some of it is still not dry, like if there's still moisture, or if you see that there's any moisture beads in the bag or the container, then you probably want to take that out and put it on your dehydrator to make sure that it is completely dry. Oops, sorry about that. Get back there. Okay, and then the last step there with, after your fruit is dry, and this is the same for all of them, is to label it and date it. So, if you're going to be eating it soon, if it's going to sit on the countertop and you're going to be eating it that week, you probably don't need to do that. But if you are going to be, dehydrating beans that you grew in your garden, you probably want to label it and date it so that you remember what it is and where it came from. Okay, so a little more about fruit. We'll talk about fruit leathers. It's basically pureed fruit. When it's dried, it's shiny and pliable. Of course, it has the texture of leather, hence the name fruit leather. You can roll it, you can cut it up into shapes or different sizes. It is, of course, a healthy choice for snacking. It is a little more candy-like than dehydrated fruit just because of the consistency. It's kind of gummy. So if somebody in your family likes fruity, gummy candy, this might be a good alternative for that candy. With fruit puree, so you can, or fruit leather, excuse me, you can use any canned or frozen fruit to make fruit leather. So you could just, blend a bunch of frozen peaches and make fruit leather that way, which actually peach leather is really good, especially if it's canned peach leather. it tastes delicious. So one thing that you can do with fruit leather to kind of extend the your fruit is to add applesauce to it, just commercial applesauce. I like to do that with all of my fruit leathers. I think it just goes a little bit further. So I'll do like this. What I have right here is applesauce and blueberries mixed together. And actually, this one on the top here, and I'll show you, is just applesauce. This is just applesauce. There's nothing added to this. It's just straight out of the jar applesauce. So you can see when I peel it up like this, it is all leathery. So I can roll this up for a snack. I can cut it, or I could just, you know, eat it right off the tray if I'm feeling I need a little snack. And then, and you saw how easy that was for me to peel off. This is the blueberry. You see it cracked just a little bit. And part of that is because of the cooking spray. So if I didn't have cooking spray on this, which the first time that I dehydrated fruit leather, I did not put cooking spray on my trays. And that's one of those things that after you do it, you never do it again, because it was so hard for me to scrape the fruit leather off. You can also use parchment paper for fruit leather if you don't want to use the spray, and then you would just peel the parchment paper and the leather apart. Fruit leather will keep for about a year if it's tightly wrapped in the freezer, or if you're going to leave it on the countertop just at room temperature for about a month. Okay, let's talk about vegetables now. So same as with fruit, you want to start with fresh. So you want your vegetables to be fresh and crisp. If you're harvesting them, you want to prepare to dehydrate them as soon as you can, because again, what you put in is what you're going to get out. If you put in a good quality green bean, you're going to get out a good quality green bean. So, and then you want to make sure to clean them in cool running water, and of course, trim them, peel them, cut them, slice them, however you need to prepare them. And again, there's information in the publication about what is recommended for each vegetable on that. Of course, cut off any bruised areas too. And prepare only as many vegetables as can be dried at one time. So if you have a bumper crop of green beans, but you can only fit, you know, so many in your dehydrator, only prepare the ones that you can dehydrate at that time. Don't, you know, cut them all ahead and leave them in the refrigerator. You can do that, but it's not going to be the best quality of vegetable that way. And of course, there's some vegetables that are better for drying than others, and that chart in your publication goes through that. Okay, so let's talk about pre-treating vegetables. Most vegetables require blanching. This is kind of the same way you do fruit, which just in boiling water and then plunged very briefly in ice cold water. And again, that inactivates the enzymes that cause the fruit to eventually rot. So we're destroying those microorganisms, and we're also setting the color basically for that vegetable. So, you know, if you know when you either boil or steam a vegetable, for example, broccoli we did yesterday, after we steamed it, it was bright green, and that color is what is going to remain. Blanching it also reduces the drying time. Okay, so it kind of loosens the vegetables so that more moisture can escape. So it's going to be a little bit quicker. And there are some vegetables that you don't need to blanch, and those include onion, garlic, peppers, and mushrooms as well. And there are two types for blanching: water and steam. So we'll talk about both of those. For water blanching, again, this is the same, you know, boiling in water and then blanching in ice cold water. It is not recommended over steam blanching. Okay, if those are our two options, steam blanching would be the better. Boiling water blanching is, you will lose more of your nutrients when that vegetable is directly in the water, and you're going to lose a little bit of that color. And the way that you can tell is if after you've boiled your vegetable, your water is the same color as that vegetable, or it has turned color, then you know that some of your nutrients has been lost that way. But you can certainly water blanch. You would fill your pot with 2/3 the way of water, bring it to a boil. You'll put your prepared vegetables. So remember, again, however you would want those to be dehydrated is how you're going to put them in the boiling water. So sliced or peeled or cored, however that might be, you'll put it in the boiling water. You can put it directly in the boiling water, but of course it's easier to use a steamer basket to lower it down in the boiling water. You'll start the time as soon as the water returns to a boil. So not once you put them in there. Put the vegetables in, turn up your heat if you need to. Once it's boiling again, then you'll start your time as indicated in your recipe for that vegetable. And then after the time is up, you will then dip those vegetables in ice cold water to stop the cooking process. And you're only going to do that briefly. We don't want to make the vegetables cold or even room temperature. You're literally just going to plunge them in, and that's going to stop that enzymatic process. And then after that point, you will shake all the water off and pat the vegetables dry if you need to remove any excess moisture before you put it on your tray to dehydrate. So steam blanching, as you can imagine, is a similar process, but instead, kind of like the fruit, instead of putting the vegetable in the water, it's going to be on top of the water in the steamer basket. So you're utilizing that steam to cook the vegetable just a little bit. And you will, for this one, you'll put same thing. You'll put your prepared vegetables into the basket. And just like the fruit, you want to make sure that your pile of vegetables is not very thick. About 2 inches is what's recommended. And you might need to stir it throughout the process to make sure that they are all cooked evenly, which is, of course, just going to be a little bit, maybe a few minutes. And after that time is up, then again, you'll pat it dry, remove the excess moisture, and dehydrate it. With vegetables, most of them are dehydrated at about 130 to 140 degrees. And 140 is probably about the magic number for most things that you're going to dehydrate. But again, use the publication guide and then your user manual to know exactly what temperature you need to dehydrate your vegetables on. Okay, so when you dehydrate vegetables, most of them will be very brittle or crisp, and some of them will shatter when you hit them. I just want to show you, I'm going to pull out of here a piece of broccoli, and actually, so I don't make a mess here, let me put this over my keyboard. So this is a little piece of broccoli here that we dehydrated, and you can see when I crush it, I don't know, you can see it's just crumbling almost. And that is how you want vegetables to be dehydrated. You want it, that is very dry. There's no moisture in that. And actually that might be like just a touch too dry, but that's how you want your vegetables to be brittle. And then let's see, I know technically a tomato is a fruit, but I have some cherry tomatoes here that we dehydrated. And you can hear, when I rattle this jar, that they are rattling up against each other. So you know that they are dry enough. And you can also read about, if you're curious, well, is this dry or not? You can read about that particular vegetable to see if there's any other tips, like the beans, it should shatter when you hit it, to know exactly when it's dry. Because if there's any moisture in there, of course, that could cause it to go bad, go rancid first. But again, with vegetables, the same with fruit, make sure it's cool before you package it, label and date it as well. And just a note about vegetables. So any vegetable that smells strong, fresh, so think of an onion or garlic, will be very odorous when you are drying them. So think also of hot peppers. I remember one year we had a bumper crop of hot peppers in the garden. And of course, we're not eating a bunch of hot peppers. We would put it in salsa and stew, but it was so many that we couldn't consume fresh. So we dehydrated them. And the day that I dehydrated peppers, you could definitely feel it in the house because your eyes were watery if you were close to that dehydrator. It smelled good, but it was a little unpleasant on the eyes. So just keep that in mind. And then another thing to keep in mind with that, with those strong smelling vegetables, is to not dehydrate strong smelling vegetables with something that is mild. So if you dehydrated onions with your apples might taste a little oniony, which, you know, you may or may not want. So just keep that in mind, that if you're dehydrating something that smells strong with something that doesn't, it will absorb those odors. I like to, if I'm doing fruit, I'm only going to do fruit. I won't do vegetables at the same time as I'm doing fruit. And that's, you know, nothing that's recommended. That's just my personal preference, just so that those flavors don't blend together. So vegetable leathers, we talked about fruit leather. You can do the same thing with vegetable leather. One of the big differences, though, is that vegetables are cooked before pureeing. So with fruit, you know, you don't have to cook it. You can do raw. But with vegetables, you probably do want to cook, you know, your sweet potatoes before you make sweet potato leather. You may need to strain vegetables after you puree them. If it's something stringy, like for example, green beans, you would probably need to strain those out before you dehydrated it into puree. But depends on the vegetable. With vegetable leather, it's a lot more common to add spices. One of my favorite is just pureed pumpkin with some pumpkin pie spices mixed in, and it's pumpkin pie leather, but doesn't have all the sugar and the sweetness in it, and it is just as tasty. And I had on that last slide there that there are recipes on page 7 of your publication. So herbs, dehydrating herbs. Of course, a lot of herbs you can just, like I say, the lazy man's way of dehydrating, and you can just almost leave them out on your countertop and they will dry, or on the vine if you have forgotten about them. But if you're dehydrating herbs that have bigger leaves and bigger stems, like for example, in the picture earlier, that was sage. So you can pick off those sage leaves and don't dehydrate the stems, just the big leaves. But again, and I know I say this a lot, check your owner's manual to make sure if there's any specific directions. You might need to use either the mesh tray for your dehydrator or the fruit leather tray, because some, as you can see in the picture there to the left, that's basil, it becomes, you know, it breaks down and it becomes crumbly. So you don't want that falling all down through your dehydrator. And the same thing if you're, you know, like I mentioned peas earlier, if you could probably fit peas just on your dehydrator tray when they are fresh, but then once they dry, they become so little and they will fall down through the cracks. So just keep that in mind, especially with herbs, so that you don't have herbs all floating down in your dehydrator. But you do want to make sure to wash your herbs before you dehydrate them. And you know, you want to make sure after you wash them under cool running water that you dry them. You get all the excess water off. And you can do that with a paper towel, you know, maybe on top of a towel and pat it down. But I like to use a salad spinner when I'm dehydrating herbs after I've washed them. Use my salad spinner to just spin some of that water off, because it can be really hard to really get that excess moisture off of herbs, especially some of the more delicate ones. The good thing about dehydrating herbs is that it doesn't take that long, usually 1 to 4 hours. Of course, you know, with anything, you're going to check it periodically. But once you know that herbs are dried and ready to store, they'll be crumbly. And you can see in that picture there, you know, that's dehydrated basil, and the pile on the right is what's crumbled up. So just make sure that it's crumbly before you dry it. But again, you do want to make sure that it's cool before you package it and label it. Okay, let's talk a little bit about drying meats, also known as jerky. We do have a publication, and it is included in the resources, whether you got those by email or you picked up or are going to pick up printed publications. This is a publication just on jerky safety. And it's important to note that that USDA, the United States Department of Agriculture, recommends that all meat be preheated before drying to ensure that any bacteria present are destroyed. And that might be a step that some folks miss, is preheating the meat. So essentially, when we say preheat, I mean, we are cooking it because we need to heat it to, and I failed to put that bullet on the slide, but heat it to 160 degrees, or poultry is 165 degrees, before putting it in the dehydrator. So you are cooking that meat before you put it in the dehydrator. And again, it goes back to the safety of meat. There is a higher chance that there is bacteria on meat than there is on a fruit or a vegetable. So it is recommended to cook that meat a little bit before you dehydrate it. A pound of meat will weigh about 4 ounces after making it into jerky. So, you know, like with anything dehydrated, it is going to be very light. It's going to take up a lot less space, and you're still getting the calories and the nutrients. It's a great snack that I love to take hiking. With dehydrating, of course, we talked about all the different methods that you can dehydrate. With meat, it is pretty important to use whichever method you're using a method where the temperature can be at least 130 degrees throughout the drying process. But again, you know, when we go back to all the methods of dehydrating, the countertop dehydrator is going to be the most effective and the safest for that. But if you have, you know, other specific questions about dehydrating meat, that publication will hopefully answer those. Okay, so again, with anything that we've dehydrated, make sure that you're using a clean, dry container that is going to seal the air out. I have a plastic freezer bag here, but I really like dehydrating in just canning mason jars because it has a really nice seal on the lid there. And aren't they pretty? Aren't they pretty all stacked up? Everything that you've dehydrated. It's definitely the appearance too. But again, make sure that you label it and date it, and package in the amount that you're going to use at one setting. So rather than, you know, if you dehydrate, let's say apples, rather than put them all in a huge gallon-sized jar, if you're going to be opening that up every day, package it in smaller containers, or package it in that big jar, and maybe you're only going to open that big jar once a week to get some apples out. So package it in smaller containers like that, so that what you don't want to do is open the jar and close it, and open it and close it, and open it and close it, because if there's any moisture in the air, that could get inside the container. So you just want to, of course, prevent any of that moisture. And, you know, depending on how long you're going to be storing the product, especially if you're new to dehydrating, if you're going to be dehydrating a lot, you might want to just check, you know, make sure there's no moisture in there. I've had that happen where I dehydrated some berries and I had them in a container, and it had been a month or so, and I checked and there was a little bit of moisture bubbles on, you know, water droplets on the bottom of the lid. I'm not really sure what happened there because it looked like everything was dry, but I made sure that, you know, I didn't keep that product stored because there was moisture in it. You can dehydrate it more if you need to. Okay, and so the last piece is using your dehydrated foods. Of course, with fruit, because that is just an easy snack to eat, that's probably the easiest to find a use for. Fruits don't rehydrate very well. You could, you know, add them to your soups or stews if you wanted. Like, I have a friend who likes to add dried apples to a beef stew that she makes, and it, you know, of course, it rehydrates like an apple, but that's not very common to just rehydrate it and eat it fresh, or eat it rehydrated like that as a snack, because it doesn't work very well. But with fruit, of course, it's just, you know, a good snack. You can make a mix with it just to eat it. But you can, you know, rehydrate it. Probably more common is like pie or dessert, rehydrating something like that. And if you do that, then you would just put it in water cover your, like, let's say apples, cover your apples with water and let it sit for 30 to 90 minutes. Want to make sure though, if you do that, to not over soak it, because that can make it kind of mushy. So, we put now too much water in it because it's like a sponge when it's dry, it'll soak up that moisture. With vegetables, you can certainly, eat them. Of course, we think of kale chips when we think of dehydrated vegetables. Those are very popular nowadays. But also zucchini and cucumber chips. I know people, will put some seasoning on those and dehydrate those, and potatoes the same, and do a healthier snack that way. Most common with dehydrated vegetables is to add them directly to soups or stews or casseroles in your cooking process. And you also want to make sure when you do that there's enough liquid, because your dried vegetables are going to absorb liquid. So if you don't have enough liquid in your casserole, for example, then it's probably going to dry your casserole out. So just make sure that there's enough liquid that your vegetables are covered that way. And you can also soak your vegetables. So if you were going to be putting, let's say, your green beans in a casserole, you can do the same, cover them with water and let them set for about 30 to 90 minutes, just until they're, mostly pliable. You want them still to be a little firm, especially if your casserole or your soup is going to have to continue to cook. And then you can add that rehydrated vegetable to your casserole or your soup. With soup, it's easier just to throw it in because there's a lot of liquid in soup usually, and you can easily add more liquid. But if you added your dried green beans to a casserole and there wasn't enough moisture, it's hard to put moisture into a casserole if there's not enough. But again, there are some vegetables that you can just eat as a snack. And like I said, I know tomatoes are technically a fruit, but I really like just dehydrated tomatoes as a little snack. Let's see, and then herbs. So that's probably the easiest one. When you've crushed those up, and you would just use those and add those as you would with any herb. It is important to note though with herbs, and I did mention this earlier, that when you're substituting your dried herbs for fresh herbs in a recipe, you'll use 1/3 of the amount that the fresh herb calls for. So if a recipe called for a tablespoon of fresh garlic and you had dried garlic, you would use 1/3 of dried garlic, which happens. So there's lots of different things that you can do with your dehydrated food. So I want to just quickly talk about some resources. And if you've been in my canning classes, I'm always talking about research-based and food safety. With dehydrating, there's not as much of a food safety issue as when we're thinking of canning. There's a lot more wiggle room in dehydrating, but the cool thing about utilizing research-based information is that that's going to be the best practice. So I just want to talk about some resources that you might utilize in addition to the publications that I have provided you with. So as I mentioned, our University of Kentucky Cooperative Extension Service publications are available. The information and the research behind those comes from the National Center for Home Food Preservation, which is housed at the University of Georgia. I know that's a big jumbly goop of acronym there, but they have a book. I've talked about this before. It's called So Easy to Preserve, from the Cooperative Extension Service at the University of Georgia. They're the National Center, and they're doing testing with all kinds of food preservation. And this book and their information online, if you go to the National Center for Home Food Preservation, their website has lots of resources on not only dehydrating, but canning and pickling and fermenting, jams and jellies, etc. So this is a really good resource. And then you might be familiar, not that I'm endorsing the brand, but you might be familiar with the Ball and Kerr brand. They're owned by the same company, and they are a company that does their own research. So the Cooperative Extension Service has basically said that, they know what they're doing, they have their own research, and it is accurate information. So there are lots of resources out there. This book it is a very common one. It's just the Ball Blue book. It's not blue, but it used to be called Blue, and they never changed the name because everybody is familiar with it. Lots of information in here, particularly on dehydrating. Of course, you know, when you think of the Ball brand, you think of canning, but this book, this preserving book, has dehydrating information as well. And then there's a couple others out there that are specific to just home food preservation in general, and lots of information on dehydrating. If you're ever looking for any other resources, or if you have a question about dehydrating or anything, let me know. One thing I forgot to mention earlier, when I was talking about the fruit leather trays, another option is reusable dehydrator sheets. And these are actually made out of Teflon. I think they have silicone too. But it's basically just, it's kind of the consistency of parchment paper, and you can use this just directly on your tray, just like that. And it's a non-stick, of course. So whatever you're putting on here will just come right off, and you don't have to use cooking spray or parchment paper. So just another little resource there. Are there any questions? No, all right. Well, thank you all for joining us today or rewatching this video. I will send out the link to everyone who has registered for the webinar today. And again, if you have any questions, just let me know. I'll be glad to help. Thanks, everybody.